Earlier on the program, the crisis in South Sudan has been topping the agenda at the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. South Africa's Defence Minister Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula will be making an official visit to Juba, the capital of South Sudan. For more on that story, we're now joined by our East Africa correspondent, Sarah Kimani, who's in Nairobi, Kenya. Thanks very much for joining us on the program. What can you tell us about the Defence Minister's trip?
Good evening, Peter. Indeed, we expect that the Defence Minister will spend at least 2 days in Juba, the capital of South Sudan, where we expect that she will meet the South Sudanese counterpart, the Minister for Defence, Kuol Manyang, and they're going to be talking about defence issues as per concerns and security issues concerning South Sudan. We also expect that they will sign a memorandum of understanding on cooperation. Very important because when the government of South Sudan was being formed in 2011, South Africa played a very important role in forming the civil service, in helping set up the civil service and also the military in the country.
All right. There are concerns, though, that, despite this peace agreement signed at the end of last year, that this has already been compromised, that getting these parties to stay the course is going to be quite a challenge. And I guess, people like the Defence Minister, they've really got it up against them to try and navigate these challenging waters.
Indeed, she does, and this especially coming just a day after the U.S. Said that it was increasingly getting frustrated with South Sudan and her neighbors and people and countries that have been involved in the peace negotiations and the peace agreement inside South Sudan, because the ceasefire has been broken several times. Fighting continues in several parts of the country. In fact, a famine is now looming in the country. At least 250,000 children at the risk of starvation, according to the United Nations Children's Fund. South Africa is a guarantor of the peace agreement that was signed in 2015, and even the previous agreements that have been signed in the country. And so it will be also upon the minister, and we understand she'll be also touching on the issues of peace and security in the country and the need for both parties to honor the ceasefire agreement that was signed.
And what's the official stance taken by the African Union? I mean, they're meeting in Ethiopia at the moment, and this certainly will be one of the most pressing issues that they have to resolve.
Yes, indeed, Peter. South Sudan will also be on the table when African Union heads of state meet in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, next week. We understand that they will be reviewing if there are any concrete steps that have been made by either of the warring sides to try and, stop the fighting, to try and get humanitarian assistance, especially getting to those people in need. This morning, the United Nations Children's Agency Executive Director toured parts of South Sudan where relief aid was getting to the people, and she was shocked at the level of malnutrition in the country, warning that the country is now risking famine. If you may remember, last year at least 4 areas in South Sudan were declared to already be having famine conditions, and so the international community worried. The African Union will be pressed to see to it that this time a solution is found, one that is lasting, because since independence, the South Sudanese independence in 2011, 8 years this year, the country still continues to suffer the same issues that they were initially clamoring for when they were looking for independence: poverty, lack of education for its people, lack of proper health care for the children and even the women, and the country now facing hyperinflation.
So both Kenya and Uganda share a border with South Sudan, and I'm just wondering if there's movement of South Sudanese into these neighboring countries that need to be accounted for.
Yes, indeed. Uganda now has the highest number of refugees in the region, having taken at least more than 1 million by the count of towards December last year, the number of South Sudanese refugees, probably because its refugee policy is more friendly than its neighbors, and especially Kenya, that has been closing its borders to refugees, indicating issues of insecurity. But Kenya still has quite a number of refugees from South Sudan, more than 70,000. And all of them staying at refugee camps, some here in the city. And they continue to say that they're facing the burden of feeding these people, sharing the same infrastructure as the locals in the areas where they are housed. This is also one of the issues that will be discussed. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is expected to be in Addis for that summit, and there will be a special session on South Sudan to discuss issues of that refugee crisis and also just how the issue can be dealt with.
All right, Sarah, that's where we're going to leave it. Thank you very much indeed for that report. That was our correspondent in Nairobi, Kenya, Sarah Kimani, who was talking to us about the visit by the Defense Minister, Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, to talk specifically about the challenges that South Sudan is facing. A peace agreement that was signed last year already been broken several times, and that the AU heads of state who are meeting in Ethiopia, that's going to be one of the top agenda items that they need to resolve. A country that at one point, when it became the newest country in the world, there was so much optimism and hope for the country, but it seems to all be crumbling a little bit with this ongoing civil war that's taking place in the country.